The lore of Tzeentch is one seriously powerful lore from one seriously powerful magical faction. It comes with a lot of highly damaging spells alongside a powerful hex and a spell for essentially unlimited magic. Even the passive is strong on this one, so it's for sure a lore worth bringing with you into battle. And of course, the only faction that can use this lore is Cinch. The passive of the lore is Fires of Change. It affects all allied units map-wide and grants them 11% damage reduction for 9 seconds. Of course, since it's a passive, there isn't really a bad way to use it. That being said, it's a pretty powerful effect for a passive with a 10% damage reduction from everything on every single unit. Even with the short duration, it's enough to protect your army from a massive cast, ranged barrage, or a couple of swings from melee units. Of course, you want to cast spells at the most opportune moment for you, but if you can time it so your army is protected against any of these things at the same time, you're going to get quite a bit of value out of it. Our first castable spell is Blue Fire of Cinch. This is a magical missile spell, costs 5 winds of magic, and has a 28-second cooldown. It can only be targeted on enemy units, and has a 175 meter cast range. It deals moderate fire and magical damage with a decent bit of armor piercing with the explosion and projectile, and it also imbues Warp Flame on the hit target. As with all magical missiles, this is best used against single entity targets to make sure that all the damage is hitting your target, rather than being wasted on single entities in a group of infantry. The damage here is decent if not out of this world, and the combination of fire damage combined with Warp Flame is going to make it hit harder against anything you send it towards. You want to target this on key single targets, preferably larger ones to ensure all the missiles land. If you can, you want to layer more damage as soon as this impacts to make the most of that Warp Flame effect. And finally, make sure you've got a clear line of sight between the caster and the target to ensure you don't hit the wrong unit or the ground and waste all your damage. The Overcast costs 9 winds of magic and doubles the armor piercing damage. You want to use this pretty much the same as the base cast, but save it when your target is at a higher HP and isn't going to lose anytime soon. The large damage all at once will knock their leadership and put them behind in whatever combat they are in. Follow all of the same rules as before, and you should be just fine. Next we have the Pink Fire of Cinch. This is a breath spell, costs 6 winds of magic, and has a 30-second cooldown. It can all be targeted on the ground, and has a 100 meter cast range. It deals low fire and magical non-armor piercing damage in an expanding tear shape, and it imbues Warp Flame on the hit units. As with most breath spells, this one is only really good versus less armored targets, where the non-armor piercing damage is going to be felt. You want to cast this into the biggest clump of enemy units you can find to ensure this hits as many entities as possible to spread that damage around. The Warp Flame passive being on as many different units as possible is also great, as that weakness to fire and armor reduction can really help your front lines and allow you to deal some serious follow-up damage to any enemy units hit. Not really much more to it than that. Just be careful to not hit your own units, as this damage has no allegiance and will damage your own troops if aimed at them. The Overcast costs 10 winds of magic and doubles the damage, but still no armor piercing. That double damage still coming with no armor piercing means this really doesn't change how you want to use this spell. You just want to use it on enemy units that have a lot of HP and not a lot of armor to make the most of that extra damage without any overkill. Still aim at those big juicy clumps and try to avoid your own troops as much as you can, and you should be golden. Next we have Treason of Siege. This is a hex spell, costs 8 winds of magic, and has a 45-second cooldown. It affects enemy units and can be targeted directly on them or on the ground, and has a 200 meter cast range. Units within the 35 meter area of effect suffer minus 16 leadership for 20 seconds. This one is of course great for using on the enemy front lines, as minus 16 leadership can easily mean the difference between a line that stays and the line that breaks. You only want to use this when you can capitalize on the enemy lines breaking, as them running away, only to come back again once the spell wears off, can be pretty useless in the long run. Make sure you push up into their backlines when they retreat or move some cav in to make the most of the opening. As long as you have any form of follow-up, you should do great. Just make sure you try to hit as many units as possible to make the most of it. The Overcast costs 12 winds of magic and now also imbues minus 24 melee attack. If for some reason you weren't going to cast it on the enemy front lines before, you will now. That massive reduction in melee attack is enough to take any unit from a damage dealer to a fairly passive front lines fighter. You want to use this on the enemy front lines, focusing on their high damage output units to curb their DPS, make it easy for your troops to beat and break them whilst taking less damage in the process. If they do break, then do the same as before and make the most of the opening rather than letting them come back once the spell wears off. Save this Overcast for later in the game when the enemy has a lot of high damage front lines, otherwise those extra wins aren't really buying you much more value. Bleed Magic is another hex and costs 8 winds of magic and has a 44-second cooldown. It can all be targeted on enemy casters and has a 200 meter cast range. It steals enemy wins and funnels them into your own wins pool, and it lasts for 23 seconds. Not really a bad time to use this one, to be honest, since you can always use more winds of magic, and their wins pool has no bearing on your generation, meaning you can spam this on cooldown to milk essentially infinite wins from enemy casters, all while draining any that they do have. So do just that. Whenever you have wins and don't need them for anything else, find the enemy caster and use this to gain even more wins with ease. Yes, you do need to spend wins to make wins, but it's net profit, so you can't really complain. The Overcast costs 12 winds of magic and doubles the duration. This is the same as the base cast, but that double duration means more wins for you and less for the enemy. So if you have more wins, then spam this on cooldown to gain even more. You can't really go wrong with this, and the only downside is the miscast chance damaging your caster, so if they are low, then stick to the base spell, but otherwise, go wild with the Overcast. Next up we have Cinch's Firestorm. This is a Vortex spell, costs 15 winds of magic and has a 51-second cooldown. It can all be targeted on the ground and has a 150 meter cast range. It creates 3 small randomly moving area of effects that deal low partially armor piercing damage to everything they touch. It imbues Warp Flame on hit units and it lasts for 17 seconds. As with all randomly moving vortexes, this one can be hard to use since your damage has just as much chance to hit the enemy and deal insane damage as it does to go into your troops and deal that damage to them, or wander off into the sunset and deal no damage to anyone. The upside of this one is the 3 smaller vortexes, meaning more chance to deal damage to the right units. To give it the best chance possible, you want to cast this into the biggest enemy clump you can find and cross everything you can that it moves how you want it to. Of course, with the somewhat decent armor piercing damage, this can be used on moderately armored forces, but anything more than 60 or so, and you'll probably want to give it a miss. The Overcast costs 20 winds of magic and doubles the armor piercing damage. Again, you still have the same chance that these vortexes will wander off and deal no damage, and 20 winds of magic is nothing to scoff at, so be pretty sure you can afford it in case it all goes wrong. Still follow all the same advice as before, but now the damage is enough for some of those late game armored forces, so feel free to cast it on a big clump of those if you can find them. I'm not really sure I'd use either of these spells since they can just be so inconsistent, but if you're feeling lucky, then they do have the potential to do some really great damage. Just hope it's to the enemy and not you. And our final spell is Infernal Gateway. This is another Vortex spell, costs 18 winds of magic and has a 54-second cooldown. It can all be targeted on the ground and has a 200 meter cast range. It deals armor piercing damage every second in a stationary 15 meter area of effect for 15 seconds. This is the Vortex spell you want to be using since it's stationary and deals all armor piercing damage all the time. This means you can cast it on a blob of armored foes and they're going to feel all the damage it's got to give no matter how tough they are. You want to do just that and find the biggest clump you can and cast this right in the middle. Make sure that enemy clump doesn't move anywhere though, as this damage doesn't slow or follow them, so is easily avoided if they're paying attention. Surround them with units of your own to keep them in place, but just be careful not to let your lads enter their area of effect, as they can feel the pain just as bad as the enemy units caught. The Overcast increases the cost to 24 winds of magic and doubles the damage. This massive cast can deal some insane damage, so wants to be used on clumps with the most armor and highest HP on the enemy side to get the absolute most out of the cast that you can. Again, you want to make sure that they don't escape, but also make sure you don't hit your own troops, as this much damage is going to seriously hurt wherever it hits. It's a massive cost, but the potential damage it can do is insane, so aim it wisely and steal some enemy wins to make up for it. And that concludes this guide on the lore of Tzeentch. Let me know what you think of the lore in the comments below, let me know what you thought of this video by leaving a like or a dislike, and if you want to see more content like this, then be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, like Dominic Schmass, Adam T, and of course Henry Tucker for their support at the Unclean Ones tier. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so here on YouTube, over on Twitch, or on Patreon, and get shoutouts at the end of videos, just like all of these wonderful people. Huge thanks to every single supporter, one final thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.